Hi, Despot of Antrim here. Last week, I finished reading The War on the West by Douglas Murray. I was wondering how I would structure it. I was really struggling to think, how am I going to review this book? How am I going to talk about it? It's so dense. He covers so many topics and so many subjects that just just explaining why I think it's a good book and everything he does right would be too long. It would take hours. So I thought I'll just write out a list of reasons why I think people should read it. So I'll try to keep this brief. Right. The first thing is that it's beautifully written. I've read Murray's last three books, and this is definitely the one that's the most readable. It has the best and most beautiful passages of writing I think I've read from him, particularly, for example, when he's defending artists who have been cancelled by the woke mob, or when he defends Western civilization and culture and ideas from people that are constantly attacking it. He writes very beautifully during those passages. All right, the second reason is that Murray understands the importance of story. This book is not excessively abstract, and it very easily could be, because he's dealing with a lot of history, a lot of ideas, a lot of cultural concepts, but he always explains them with little stories and illustrations and examples, and the stories of real people that have been affected by the woke revolution in the West, and that makes it very, very readable. This is a book that is filled with stories, so that makes it much more enjoyable and fun to read and easier to read, because it's filled with the stories of people. It's not just a bunch of ideas. So number three, I would say this is a cautionary tale. This book, it's a cautionary tale of cowardice in a time when telling the truth is becoming taboo. And I think that after the George Floyd incident, telling the truth just became much more difficult in the West in general, particularly in the United States and in the UK. Simply being honest about, for example, who George Floyd was and the fact that he was a scumbag and he once held a gun on a pregnant lady so his buddies could rob her house, for example. Just saying that would get you in trouble. It could get you banned from social media. It could lose your friends, and it could potentially cause you to lose your job. But of course, very few people had the balls to turn around and say that. And there are many other examples of people who simply weren't willing and are not willing to stand up to the beast that is the woke mob and to push back against them, because people are so terrified in the cultural moment that we have been living in for the past couple of years to just stand up and say, no, this is nonsense. Fuck off. I don't believe any of this. And I'm not going to have my people, my country, my civilization denigrated like this. That's a hard thing to do. And this is a tale of many individuals who honestly have just been cowards at this time. For example, orchestra conductors who have gone along when they have been told to fire half their staff because their staff are white, and they want to increase diversity and inclusion. And of course, the best way to increase inclusion is to fire half the staff that you've been working with. So that's just cowardice. That's just spineless. And that's just one example he gives in the book. There are many other examples of people who are just going along to get along. And that brings me on to my next point, what I call the Red Guard principle. So the Red Guard refers to kids, mostly teenagers in 1960s China, who persecuted the Cultural Revolution on the Chinese population on behalf of Mao. And they committed horrendous crimes, crimes against people as well as cultural crimes. They destroyed a lot of old Chinese tombs and graveyards and statues and texts. Does any of this sound familiar? And they were doing this on behalf of the Cultural Revolution, the ideas of Mao. And many of them didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand the politics of it. They were just going along with this crowd of kids in their stupid Red Guard pajamas with their little red book, because they didn't want to be in the way of the bully. This is basically join the bully or become his victim. Most people will join the bully in that situation. Most will. Some will stand up, and some people are doing that. But the fact is, it is human psychology that you can call it the Red Guard principle. When there is a big cultural force that is acting like a massive bully on society, most people don't want to be the next victim, so they'll just join it, or they'll shut up and hope that it doesn't come for them. So there's a lot of examples of that in the book, and I think that's a really important principle to understand. So yeah, the Red Guard principle, very important to understand, and it appears a lot in this book. Okay, so reason number 5 is in order to gain a broader perspective on history. Obviously, the narrative, you just take the slavery narrative, for example. When you talk to Americans about slavery, they immediately think of the transatlantic slave trade, when in fact slavery is and was universal. It was universal across the world. Every single society practiced it until the West abolished it. And that's just one example. There are other examples of, for example, war and atrocities and many other crimes that human beings have committed against other human beings all the way throughout history. But certainly the Western education system and the Western political debate only focuses on the crimes of the West. So I think this book does give you a broader perspective, because it tells you a lot about the history of the crimes of other parts of the world. Not a lot, but it does tell you enough about it that it does help you to have a broader perspective, which I think is important. So number 6, understanding what is happening in the West right now. So when you see all the crazy stuff that's going on in the world, it's almost like a big fog, and you think that the world is just on its fucking head. But actually, what you learn from this book is that the West is in a process of a seditious, top-down cultural revolution, which is part of a political strategy of demoralization, division, and conquest. That's why they want to get rid of the Churchill statue. If you can get the British people to tolerate the complete destruction and the removal of all public edifices of their greatest hero, they will accept anything. They're beaten, completely beaten, and you can do whatever you want to them. So that's just one example. The Churchill example is the best example of that, and that's what it's all about ultimately. That the whole message, the diversity, inclusion, LGBT plus thing, it's all part of a demoralization, division campaign to utterly destroy the West psychologically, so that it can be ruled over by elites, left-wing elites. It used to be divide and conquer, but I think that has become demoralize, divide and conquer. And this book explains how that's happening, why it's happening, and you'll understand a lot more about that if you read this book. So number 7, it'll help you understand why the West is such a special and unique place in history. I'll just give one example of this. You look at Japan in the 1850s, before the Americans arrived with their gunboats, and Japan began to westernize voluntarily. Prior to that, if a samurai came across a peasant who would not bow to him, the samurai was legally obliged to cut his head off. All right, that was the Japanese in their own society prior to the arrival of Western ideas and Western civilization. Okay, and this is a great people today, one of the great countries in the world who have given a lot to the world, but that was where they were at in history prior to their interaction with Western ideas. So and that's like I said, that's just one example. There are many examples of why the West is such a special place. Everything that it's given to the world in terms of culture, medicine, architecture, literature, and so forth. So the book does help you to understand that you wake up in a free country and you have the right to vote, and you are protected by the police, and you're not living in a corrupt country, and you can change the government without having a civil war. People take that for granted. This book helps you understand, no, those good things about the West are there for a reason. All right, that's not a natural state for human beings. All right, so number 8 is it will provide you with the vocabulary you need to understand and rebut the attacks that are being launched against the West. So one thing the left is very good at is its use of language. It constantly twists and contorts language to confuse the argument and to make it difficult to argue against them. And this book is aware of that, and just reading the book will make you familiar with the vocabulary of the debate, and when you're familiar with that vocabulary, not only can you argue against it, you can think about it more clearly. So that's a good reason to read this. Okay, number 9, it exposes the anti-racism movement as the opportunistic grift that it is. So a lot of the anti-racist authors, Murray goes through their books and he selects passages from them and argues against their main ideas. And he exposes their books for just the tripe that they are. They're for example, Ibram X. Kendi, one of his big examples of the racism that he suffered growing up was he was in a classroom and two girls stuck their hand up, a black girl and a very eager white girl, and the teacher selected the white girl. And that's it. That's his big example of horrible racism in his life. And that's the best he can do. And of course, Murray's point is, if that's the best you can do, you're probably not living in a society that has problems with racism. So he and that's just one example of all the times that Murray pushes back against the anti-racism industry and shows it up for the fact that it is just a grift that is there to make money, sell books, sell speaking tours and all that crap. A lot of it is money driven, although there is obviously, of course, an ideological component to it. Number 10, it provides a counter to the anti-Western narrative. It talks about the extensive efforts that have been made to demoralize the West, to destroy its cultural ideas, to attack its history, to suggest that everything about the West is evil and racist and imperialist and colonialist and all the other ists. And in a time when it's very difficult to push back against that and to provide a context for that and a counterweight to that, this book, I think, is an important cultural asset, an important book which does actually rebut those ideas and show them up for the shite that they are. And it might be a very small thing, but still it's at least an attempt to try to rebalance the scales, to say, okay, yes, of course the West committed crimes. Everybody committed crimes. And as far as historical crimes go, the West is nowhere near the worst offender. And in fact, it was the West that brought the world into the modern age and ended so many of these horrible crimes that afflicted humanity. So it's a good counter narrative in the sense that it is actually talking about the truth, the reality of history, as opposed to history as seen through a woke lens. And the last reason you should read the book is that it exposes the absurdity and injustice of the modern racialist zeitgeist. So simply put, modern anti-racism and wokeism, it's a racialist ideology. It's an ideology which seeks to divide society along racial lines, mostly racial. Other lines also, like sexual, for example. If you're gay, you're not a white man anymore. You're not a gay white man, so you belong over here. And if you're straight, you're over here. And if you're mixed race, you're over here. And if you're white, you're over here. And it's trying to basically say, to dictate what people can and can't have in life, where they should and shouldn't be in the social hierarchy based upon their immutable characteristics. It's an utterly evil and disgusting idea. It is just sick to suggest that you cannot play in an orchestra because you are white. That is a sick thing to believe, or to suggest that you are entitled to extra privileges, including free money because you're Black. Again, that is a disgusting idea. Judging people based on their race, it's wrong and it's evil, and it needs to be called out for that. And this book does call it out as the evil and absurd and utterly racialist garbage that it is. It's quite ironic. I've read a lot of history, and especially 20th century history. And the only political entity that has been so obsessed with race as the woke mob, as the wokeists are today, the extreme left-wing woke ideologues, the only real political analogy I can find in history is the Nazis. Those are the only people who were as obsessed with race as modern left-wing wokeists. And that's quite ironic, but that's the reality, that the Nazis were obsessed with race, and the modern left-wing demagogue ideologues they're consumed by race. It's just disgusting, and people should reject it utterly. So those are 11 reasons I think you should read this book. All right, thanks for listening.